What if I told you that the only thing keeping you from your dreams is the very mind you trust every single day? You were never warned about this kind of prison because it doesn't feel like one. It feels like routine. It feels like logic. It feels like being realistic. And that's exactly why it works so well. You wake up each day believing you're making conscious choices, yet most of your life is run on invisible scripts written long ago. Patterns of thought repeat themselves so quietly that you mistake them for your own voice. And over time, those thoughts stop feeling like opinions and start feeling like facts. This is where the prison truly begins. Not when you feel pain, but when you stop questioning it. The mind learns early how to protect itself. It studies what gets rewarded, what gets punished, what gets ignored. Slowly, it builds a system designed not for truth, but for survival. And survival is conservative. It avoids risk. It clings to familiarity. It chooses predictability over possibility. This is why the prison doesn't announce itself with fear. It announces itself with comfort, with routines that feel safe, with explanations that sound reasonable, with a quiet voice saying, "This is just how things are." You don't see the bars because they are made of beliefs. Beliefs about what you're capable of. Beliefs about what people like you can or cannot do. Beliefs formed in moments you barely remember. A comment, a failure, a comparison, a disappointment. These moments don't disappear. They sink beneath awareness and begin shaping your decisions from the shadows. You call it personality. You call it realism. But much of it is unexamined conditioning. And here's the most unsettling part. The prison is self-maintaining. No external force is required anymore. You enforce the rules yourself. You censor your own desires before they fully form. You dismiss your own instincts before they can speak clearly. You hesitate automatically without knowing why. This is how control becomes internalized. The walls don't need to push you back. You stop yourself before you ever reach them. This is why intelligent people often remain trapped longer than others. Intelligence gives you explanations. And explanations, when misused, become justifications. You learn how to explain away your dissatisfaction. You intellectualize your unhappiness. You analyze your stagnation instead of confronting it. The mind becomes so skilled at understanding the prison that it forgets to escape it. Insight replaces action. Awareness replaces courage. And slowly, thinking becomes a substitute for living. The invisible prison thrives on one illusion above all others, that you have time. Time to change later. Time to start when conditions are perfect. Time to become who you sense you could be. But time, when paired with inaction, doesn't heal, it hardens. Each year you delay, the identity of who you are becomes more rigid. The bars grow thicker not because life closes in, but because you keep confirming the same story about yourself. You may tell yourself you're waiting for clarity, but clarity often comes after movement, not before it. You may tell yourself you're being cautious, but caution, repeated endlessly, becomes fear wearing a respectable disguise. You may tell yourself you're content, but contentment without vitality is often just resignation that has learned to smile. The prison is invisible because it speaks in your own language. It uses your memories, your logic, your voice. It doesn't command, it suggests. It doesn't forbid, it questions. Is this realistic? What if you fail? What will people think? These questions feel intelligent, responsible, mature, yet they are rarely neutral. They are shaped by an unconscious need to remain unchanged. And the longer you live inside this structure, the more threatening freedom feels. Because freedom would require you to confront parts of yourself you've kept suppressed, desires you labeled as impractical, strengths you avoided because they would demand responsibility, a version of you that would no longer fit comfortably into old roles. The prison protects you from that confrontation, but it also keeps you small. Most people assume suffering comes from external circumstances, but much of it comes from the quiet conflict between who you are and who you sense you could become. That tension doesn't disappear when ignored. It turns inward. It shows up as restlessness, as fatigue without cause, as a persistent feeling that something is missing, though you can't name what it is. This is the cost of the invisible prison. Not dramatic collapse, but slow erosion. You don't lose everything at once. You lose momentum. You lose curiosity. You lose the ability to imagine yourself differently. And one day, you wake up shocked by how long you've been standing still. But here is the turning point. The moment the walls begin to weaken. The prison can only exist as long as it remains unseen. The instant you recognize that many of your limits are learned, not innate, something shifts. The moment you question the authority of the thoughts that have governed you for years, cracks appear. You don't need to destroy the prison all at once. You only need to see it clearly, because awareness, when paired with honesty, begins to dissolve what fear worked so hard to build. And the most important realization of all is this: the prison did not begin with you, but it can end with you. The moment you stop mistaking familiarity for truth is the moment the door begins to open. Once the door cracks open, something unexpected happens. Resistance rises, not from the world but from within you, because the second layer of the invisible prison is not ignorance. It is attachment. Attachment to the identity you have built to survive. Even when that identity is limiting, it feels familiar, and familiarity feels safe. The mind does not ask, "Is this who you could become?" It asks, "Will this keep you accepted? Will this keep you protected?" That is the question running quietly beneath your decisions. You are not only trapped by what you fear, you are trapped by what has worked before. At some point in your life, being cautious protected you. Being agreeable kept you connected. Being silent avoided conflict. Being rational helped you make sense of chaos. These strategies were intelligent responses to earlier environments. But the mind rarely updates its rules automatically. What once saved you can later confine you. And the tragedy is not that these patterns exist. It's that you continue to obey them long after their purpose has expired. This is where the prison grows stronger, because now the bars are reinforced by loyalty to the past, to who you had to be in order to cope, to the version of yourself that earned approval, avoided pain, or stayed invisible enough to survive. Letting go of these patterns feels like betrayal, not of others but of yourself. The mind whispers, "If I change, who am I without these defenses?" And that question alone is enough to keep you still. You begin to confuse identity with essence. You think, like, this is just who I am, when in truth it is who you learned to be. You mistake repetition for truth. And the more you repeat a role, the more real it feels. Eventually, the role becomes a cage. Not because it is false, but because it is incomplete. The invisible prison thrives when you reduce yourself to a single dimension. You call yourself the thinker, so you avoid action. You call yourself the strong one, so you never ask for help. You call yourself the realist, so you silence your imagination. Each label feels empowering at first, but over time it narrows you, and what narrows you begins to control you. This is why growth feels threatening. Growth does not simply add something new, it dismantles something old. And dismantling identity feels like death to the psyche. Not physical death, but symbolic death. The death of a story you've told yourself for years. The death of excuses that once felt logical. The death of comfort disguised as wisdom. So the mind resists. It brings up past failures to prove that change is dangerous. It magnifies uncertainty to justify hesitation. It reminds you of responsibility, consequences, expectations. And again, it does this using intelligence. That's what makes it convincing. The prison doesn't argue emotionally, it argues logically. It doesn't say, "Don't grow," it says, "This isn't the right time." And so you wait. You wait for confidence. You wait for certainty. You wait for permission, often without realizing it. But confidence is not the cause of movement. It is the result of it. Certainty is not found before action. It is built through it. And permission, if it ever comes, usually comes too late. Here is the deeper truth most people avoid. Staying the same is not neutral. It is an active choice with consequences. Every year you delay stepping into your fuller potential. The gap between who you are and who you could be grows wider, and that gap becomes painful to look at. So you distract yourself. You stay busy. You become productive, but not purposeful. Efficient, but not alive. This is the silent suffering of intelligent minds. You know too much to be comfortable with illusions, but you act too little to experience transformation. You stand between awareness and action, trapped in analysis. And analysis, when it replaces movement, becomes another wall of the prison. The mind tells you that change must be dramatic, total, perfect. But that belief itself is a trap, because perfection is paralyzing. The prison convinces you that unless you can do everything, you should do nothing. Unless the plan is flawless, it's not worth starting. And so you remain in preparation, forever preparing, never arriving. But transformation does not require certainty. It requires honesty. Honesty about the ways you hide behind thought. Honesty about the comfort you protect at the cost of growth. Honesty about the fear that pretends to be logic. The invisible prison begins to weaken not when you fight it, but when you stop justifying it. When you admit that some of your reasons are actually defenses. when you accept that safety has become your greatest limitation, and in that moment, uncomfortable, quiet, and deeply personal, something shifts again. You realize the prison is not holding you hostage, you are holding on to it. And the moment you loosen your grip, the walls no longer feel so solid. Once that realization settles in, that you are not being held, but holding on, the prison reveals its third layer, fear of responsibility. Not the kind of responsibility that comes from external pressure, but the deeper kind, the responsibility of becoming conscious of your own power. Because once you see clearly that the walls are partly self-constructed, you can no longer blame circumstance alone, and that truth is heavy. Freedom demands accountability. If you can change, then you must decide whether you will. And that choice removes the comfort of victimhood. This is where many people unconsciously retreat. It is easier to believe you are blocked than to admit you are afraid of what happens if you are not. Because if you are no longer trapped, then every unrealized potential becomes a question directed at you. Why didn't you act? Why did you wait? Why did you settle? The mind would rather stay confined than face those questions honestly. So it creates a new illusion, the illusion of helplessness. You begin to say things like, "This is just how life is," or "People like me don't get ahead," or "I missed my chance." These statements feel realistic, even mature, but look closely. They are not truths. They are conclusions designed to end the conversation. They shut down inner conflict by pretending there are no alternatives. This is how the prison becomes self-maintaining. You no longer need walls when beliefs do the job. You no longer need guards when doubt enforces the rules. You police your own thoughts. You correct your own impulses toward growth. Whenever a bold idea arises, a quiet voice responds instantly. Be realistic. And that word, realistic, becomes one of the strongest bars. Because realism, when distorted, is simply fear dressed as wisdom. You confuse caution with intelligence. You confuse restraint with maturity. You confuse avoidance with patience. And slowly, you begin to admire your own limitation. You call it discipline. You call it stability. You call it being grounded. But beneath those labels is a subtle shrinking of life. The mind prefers what it can predict. Expansion brings unpredictability, and unpredictability threatens control. So even positive change feels dangerous, not because it will harm you, but because it will transform you. And transformation means stepping into the unknown, where your old identity has no authority. This is why people sabotage themselves at the edge of growth. Right before progress, anxiety spikes. Right before clarity, confusion intensifies. Right before commitment, distractions multiply. These are not coincidences. They are defensive reactions. The psyche senses that a threshold is being crossed, and it panics. Not because something bad is about to happen, but because something familiar is about to end. And endings frighten the unconscious mind, because endings mean loss. Loss of certainty, loss of excuses, loss of the comfort of saying, "I could have been more, if only." That sentence allows infinite potential without risk. But action collapses possibility into reality, and reality can fail. So the mind clings to potential like a shield. It feels safer to imagine greatness than to attempt it. This is one of the cruelest tricks of the invisible prison. It lets you feel special without being fulfilled. You know you are capable of more. Others may even tell you that you are. But capability without expression becomes torment. It creates restlessness, dissatisfaction, and quiet resentment, not toward the world, but toward yourself. And instead of addressing that pain directly, you numb it. You consume information. You plan, you reflect, you wait for the right moment. But the right moment never arrives, because the prison is not waiting for time. It is waiting for courage.